Hello, my name is Kendra with Beyond Walls Tutoring. I am going to be pulling different poems from African American authors from this book called The Book of American Negro Poetry. It is an older book, but the authors in here are very relevant. If your child is in middle school, high school, even elementary school, and you want to expose them to poetry from African American authors, but not sure where to start, you may want to use some of these older books. That's where you can find a lot of quality poetry from them, where you can look at dialect, you can look at rhyme schemes, and just genuinely learn about different authors and the way they take some of the things going on around them and putting it to paper. One of the authors that I'm going to introduce you to or reintroduce to some is a man by the name of Paul Lawrence Dunbar. What I like to do first is I'm just going to read to you about who he is before I even introduce you to some of the poetry. Okay. So if you have any middle school, high school students who are getting into that point where they're going to be reading poetry, or if you just want them to read poems that are not necessarily in everyday textbooks that they will be doing in their English classes. Books like this is an old book. You see it, the barcode from the school where I got it from is, I've had it for a while, just an old book that they give away. So I have that here. The copyright of this book, let me find out. Original copyright is 1931. Okay. And the last copyright, when it was renewed for this book that I have in my hands here, is 1950. So it could have been re-copyrighted or renewed after that time, but this is just the book that I have in my hand. Okay. So originally written 1931. Okay. All right. So again, this is about a man named Paul Lawrence Dunbar. All right. Paul Lawrence Dunbar was born in Dayton, Ohio, June 27th, 1872, the son of former slaves. He attended the public schools of that city and was graduated from the high school in 1891. He began writing verse during his grammar school days. Some of his early poems he wrote while earning a living by running a passenger elevator in a Dayton building. His first volume of poems, Oak and Ivy, was published in 1893 and was sold chiefly through his own efforts. A second volume, Majors and Minors, of which he was also chief salesman, appeared in January 1895. A very favorable review of this book by William Dean Howells attracted attention to the poems of the poet and made possible the bringing out of a third volume, Lyrics of Lowly Life, under the imprint of Dodd Mead and Company, New York. This third volume, with an introduction by Howells, gained an instant national recognition for Dunbar. Lyrics of Lowly Life, 1896, was followed by Lyrics of the Hearth Side, 1899. Lyrics of Love and Laughter, 1903, and Lyrics of Sunshine and Shadow, 1905. From the poems in these volumes, several editions of illustrated poems were culled and printed. In 1899, influential friends secured for him an appointment to a position in the Congressional Library, but the job irked him and he gave it up. The edition of Dunbar's collective poems was brought out in 1918. A number of his lyrics have been set to music by well known composers. There have been many changes in the estimates of Negro poetry since Dunbar died February 9th, 1906. But he still holds his place as the first American Negro poet of real literary distinction. There are some who will differ with this statement, feeling that it should be made about Phyllis Wheatley. It is true that Phyllis Wheatley did measure up to the best of her contemporaries, But it must be remembered that not one of her contemporaries was a poet of real literary distinction. Dunbar was the first to demonstrate a high degree of poetic talent combined with literary training and technical proficiency. In the field in which he became best known, Negro dialect poetry, his work has not been excelled. Dunbar's fame rests almost wholly upon his Negro dialect poetry. He was not the first, however, to write Negro dialect poems, nor did he himself begin by writing in Negro dialect. Irwin Russell, 1853 to 79, a white poet, was perhaps the first to use the dialect in a literary verse form. A glance at his work will reveal how much Dunbar indebted to him. It will also reveal that Dunbar surpasses him. Dunbar's earliest verses show the influence of James Whitcomb Riley and were patterned after Riley's Hoosier dialect poetry. This influence persisted even after Dunbar began writing in Negro dialect, but it did not limit him. It was interesting to compare Dunbar's When They Come Pon Down Hot and Riley's When the Forest is on the Pumpkin, and note the similarity of sentiment and the nearly identical rhythmic structure. It is also interesting to note how Dunbar demonstrates a defter technique and more delicate sense in handling the nuances of sentiment than his early master. He gives When They Come Pon Down Hot a more musical tilt and reduces medical monotony by compressing his stanza in what is actually a a verse scheme of six couplets. And by this line arrangement, he gives to the reoccurring title line a cumulative force that Riley misses, giving to the title line of When the Frost is on the Pumpkin. Dunbar profited by Riley's influence and he transcended it. Dunbar made Negro dialect poetry popular and so founded a school. He was imitated by many writers, both white and colored, none of whom quite equaled him in humor, tenderness, and charm, and in the finish with which he generally worked. He was also the author of many poems done in literary English, a number of which are very high order. Ere sleep comes down to soothe the weary eyes is by all the test of one among the finest poems in American literature. It possesses moving sincerity, passion, and beauty. It carries finality and is done with faultless workmanship, and it does not stand entirely unmatched among his poems in literary English. Partly because of his magnificent voice, he was a very successful reader of his own poetry, and in this way, able to add greatly to its popularity. Much of the poetry which Dunbar's fame rests has passed, just just much of the poetry of his even more popular contemporary Riley has passed. Dialect poetry still holds a place in American literature, but the place itself is no longer considered an important one. The qualities that gave its vogue tenderness, sentimentality, homely humor, genial optimism are the very qualities that now bring disparagement upon it. Dunbar wrought delightful music in the dialect and gained the national ear, but perhaps after all, the final estimate of him will rest upon those poems in literary English in which he sincerely and courageously voiced his own people together, in which he achieved the universal note, probably a judgment he would have desired most. In addition to poetical works, Dunbar was the author of four novels: The Uncalled, The Love of Landry, The Sport of the Gods, and The Fanatics. He was a frequent contributor of short stories to magazines, and these were collected and published in several volumes. That was just a little background of Paul Laurence Dunbar. Come back next time, and I will be reading one of his famous poems and having a discussion about it and looking at some of the dialect. Okay, I look forward to seeing you next time. Come back to this channel and we'll discuss Paul Laurence Dunbar. See you next time.